everyone. Welcome to the October 17th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and it's probably going to be a shorter podcast than usual because, as is typical in the weeks leading up to the Breeders' Cup, there just isn't that much top-level racing action. We did have one Grade 1 race at Keeneland this past week. That was the Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, the feature race there on Saturday. I guess there was also one or two other Breeders' Cup preps run, if you want to call them that, at Keeneland this week, those being the Franklin Stakes and the Sycamore. I suppose it's possible those races could produce a few runners for the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint and the Turf, respectively. But for the most part, the Breeders' Cup preps are generally in the books at this point. We did see some potential 2-year-old stars this weekend, particularly one at Keeneland that we're going to talk about, as well as Santa Anita, some interesting maiden breakers. We'll talk about a few races from Belmont at the Big A, Aqueduct. There was a stakes race and also a New York Bred Allowance race that we'll mention. And then on Saturday at Laurel, they ran their Maryland Million card. We'll talk about one race from that day that earned a pretty nice speed figure. But Craig, like I was saying, and as you did the rundown this week, you were telling me just not that many 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures and not a whole lot to talk about in terms of divisional implications this week.
No, like you said, maybe a couple of these horses will show up in the Breeders' Cup. The race we're going to start with, the QE2 at Keeneland, turned out to be a very good race. No surprise given the quality, as we have mentioned on the forecast, but not your typical week. We're just, given the way racing is today, we're a little too close to see too many preps for the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, we are now less than 3 weeks out from the Breeders' Cup. Craig and I were just talking about this before we started recording today. I think the pre-entries are going to be released next week, so we'll probably start talking about the Breeders' Cup on this podcast. At that time, we'll plan maybe one or two episodes where we discuss and break down some of those Breeders' Cup races, but that's something to look forward to next week. As far as this week goes, we'll be looking back at last week's racing, and Craig, will start right where you were saying, at Keeneland with that Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, the Grade 1 race on Saturday, and it was won by Maj, the European shipper for Godolphin, and Saeed bin Sarur, who we don't see training that many horses for Godolphin these days, at least not at the highest level, but once upon a time he had the top string of horses for Godolphin and was winning a slew of Grade 1 races in the, I believe, the late 90s and early 2000s, but haven't seen too many starters in the US for him, at least in recent years, but they sent Maj over to compete in this race, and she certainly lived up to the hype because she had come in with a big reputation, having won the English 1000 Guineas going all the way back to the springtime. Obviously a setback during the summer that forced her to miss much of the year, but they talked about using this as a prep race for the Breeders' Cup, Craig, and I think they probably got just out of it what they wanted to.
Yeah, she was very good. It looked like maybe she got a little weary at the end, but maybe not because the runner-up is pretty good too in Lindy, and Maj delivered. It was good to see off that layoff from early May. I mean, we're talking almost 6 months now, and didn't seem to phase her as she was able to handle what was a pretty strong field given that so many shipped over for, so many Europeans or recently transplanted Europeans were in here. She ran a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, so a couple points better than her Timeform figure she got back in May, and seems like there's some more upside in the tank. I would expect her to be tighter for the next start.
Yeah, horses that are trained in Europe or had previously or in the recent past been trained in Europe finished 1, 2, 4, 5 in this race, first, second, fourth, and fifth. So a lot of just domination by that European form in here. Not a big surprise. We had seen some talent in the 3-year-old turf division this year, but it was more so with the 3-year-old male horses, not the fillies. So not a big surprise that they were susceptible to some really talented shippers from Europe for this race. And Maj definitely leading that charge. She took all the money going off at 6-5. I did notice in the early stages of this race that she seemed really keyed up, moving through the stretch for the first time. She was overstriding a little bit, seeming like she wanted to do more, but Aishan Murphy did a good job getting her to relax, and she was able to get over to the inside position. And watching a few of the turf races, Craig, I did think that, especially on these days where the rails were down at 0 feet, that it felt like you wanted to be inside. This race was actually dominated by horses that were racing on the rail. Both the first, second, and third place finishers, Maj, Lindy, and Mission of Joy, rode the rail for the majority of their trips. Lindy obviously angled out at the top of the stretch to make that run. She just couldn't quite catch Maj at the end. Craig, they did mention two possible Breeders' Cup targets for Maj, either the mile against the males or the filly and mare turf. Based on this race, I'm not sure that I'd really want to see her going a mile and a quarter. She doesn't strike me as that type. She's a pretty small, compact horse. She's got a big extended stride on her, but she's not the biggest horse. She doesn't strike me as one that really wants a mile and a quarter. Maybe at Santa Anita it would be a different story, but the mile is possibly the better fit for her from a distance standpoint. It's just probably tougher competition.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma because the tougher competition would definitely be in the mile, I would imagine, but the distance could be a hurdle. So it will be interesting to see which race they choose. Honestly, I'm not sure which direction I'd go. Probably lean a little bit towards the mile based on the distance, but it's not an easy call.
Yeah, and a few of the horses that could be running in the filly and mare turf, like Maj or in Italian, also have options for the mile. So Gina Romantica, I think, is another one, although she seems more likely to stretch out to the filly and mare turf. So a few female horses that could go in either direction. So I think the strength of that filly and mare turf is in flux a little bit. Obviously, much of it will depend on who ships over from Europe for that race. But I wouldn't rule out horses like Lindy or Elusive Princess didn't run quite as well here. But if the connections were considering using this as a prep for that race, usually I would be a little skeptical of horses coming out of this 3-year-old restricted race, the QE2, moving into the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. But like you said, Craig, this did feel like an unusually strong edition of this Grade 1.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in Lindy. I really liked how she finished off that race. We had seen her do the same thing at Kentucky Downs with a nice win. And when you look at the chart, the top four ran 1, 2, 3 around the track, except for her kind of breaking up the party coming from much further back. She did save ground, as you noted, but I really liked her finishing kick.
We had another potential Breeders' Cup prep run on Sunday at Keeneland. That was the Grade 2 Franklin Stakes. This one going 5.5 furlongs on the turf for the fillies and mares. This was supposed to be the final tune-up for Caravel, defending her title in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint in just 3 weeks' time, or less than 3 weeks from this race. And not sure that they got exactly the prep they were hoping for, Craig, because when you go off as the 3-5 favorite, as the former leader of this division, you're supposed to beat a field, especially of fillies, but she couldn't quite get the job done as Tony Ann was able to outclose her through the stretch. Caravel was game trying to come back inside of that rival in the late stages, but she still came out of the losing end of that photo finish.
Yeah, I thought she ran fine, but you have to be a little concerned. She had 4 straight 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures until her last two, where she's regressed into 117, 118. And going into this race, I kind of thought she might be up against it from that rail position, and we knew there was speed to her outside, and that proved to be the case. But I don't want to use it as too much of an excuse because as I was watching the race when they broke, I thought, uh-oh, this is the trip I envisioned. It's not going to go well for her. And by the time they have run a quarter mile, she actually fell into a pretty good trip, sitting third, basically by herself. And she ran okay, but I just don't want to excuse that rail draw and put a line through the race. I just think maybe she's not quite the same horse we saw last year at this point.
Yeah, I think we do have to point out the pace of this race was extremely fast. The first two fractions, both color-coded in red. I think the leader, Twilight Gleaming, got a 143 pace figure for the opening quarter. So they were really moving up front, and maybe the difference was Caravel was about 2 lengths ahead of Tony Ann at that first call when they were going so quickly on the front end, and it just seemed like maybe being in closer attendance to that pace might have cost her the victory here. We should mention Twilight Gleaming, who was fourth, arguably ran the best race of all, because she actually hung on pretty well to lose this race by only about 1.25 lengths when all was said and done. So if they were trying to use this as a prep for her to go to the Breeders' Cup, the turn back to 5 furlongs could really work for her. So maybe a horse to keep tabs on. I don't know if she's got the credentials to get into a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. I believe that field is capped at 12, but just something to maybe keep in mind when those pre-entries get released next week. But as for Caravel, it does sort of feel like she's tailed off a little bit to when she was at her peak, and it's something we talked about last week, Craig, I think we were mentioning within Italian, we sometimes take for granted that these horses are going to stay at their peak for an entire season, and it's really hard to do. She obviously was in great form when she won the Breeders' Cup last year, but it's a lot to ask of these horses to stay that good for an entire year after that, and it's possible that she's just tailing off a little bit. That's to be expected, but it was just a prep, so we'll see if she can do better in the Breeders' Cup next month.
Yeah, and I do want to mention the winner, who I thought ran very well, got a 118 time from US speed figure. Did get a very nice setup, but she's just a 5-year old. Phil D'Amato shows he can ship to Kentucky, particularly Keeneland, and do pretty well with these horses. So I'm not sure if they're playing in the Breeders' Cup for her. That could be a little steep, but a good solid race. And I did want to mention that this was one of those days where there was another 5.5 furlong race just 2 races before, and it was for really good horses, non-winners of 4 allowance, something we rarely ever see these days. And this race was even still a little bit quicker than those males ran, so it was a good solid race for the division. I'm just not sure if it screams Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify something that I said on Twitter that was maybe a little bit unfair about Joel Rosario's ride on Wakanaka. She was trying to close into a race that was collapsing, so I mean, she only finished fifth. I think you would have expected her to do better if she was really in a position to win this race. I thought it was curious that she wound up trying to slice between the field at the final eighth of a mile of this race, because as a deep closer, you generally want to steer these horses to the outside, especially when they've gone so fast up front and you surmise that the race is going to collapse in front of you. Watching the pan of this race was almost impossible to follow a horse like Wakanaka, because the pan shot on the replay, it's just she's basically out of the frame for most of it because they're so cropped in and zoomed on the leaders. But I did watch the head on, and the number 3 trained Artemis sort of veered out ahead of her, and it wasn't so much Joel Rosario angling in as the horse veering out in front of her, and he probably did have an opportunity to veer out himself and go outside of that horse, but he just chose to keep a straight path. So what I said on Twitter was a little inaccurate about his ride, so I just wanted to clarify that. And I will say, somebody at Keeneland did reach out to me about my concerns about the way that they're filming their races, and basically acknowledging that they see the difference between how they're being captured this year as opposed to last year. And I actually showed that person just this race and last year's 2022 Franklin side by side, and how much more zoomed in they are, and hopefully they're going to be able to do something about that. So nice when people in positions to change something are listening.
Yeah, that is a good thing. I mentioned similar with the run-up situation for the couple of mile races. I think it was last weekend, and to their word, they've been keeping the run-up the same. So it is good to hear that the management is listening.
On Friday at Keeneland, the feature race was the Grade 3 Sycamore, and it was a big weekend for Godolphin, Craig, as it seems like whatever disappointments they had earlier in the year, well, they're certainly cleaning up in the month of October. Bold Act, who was going out this time for Charlie Appleby, and Godolphin, as ridden by Jamie Spencer, who we'll talk about again in just a little bit, they got the job done with this 3-year-old gelding, facing a field of older horses that we've grown accustomed to seeing in this division. They're okay, but obviously they were going to be susceptible to an up-and-coming horse like Bold Act, and he got a good trip and ride from Jamie Spencer and was just too good for this group.
Yeah, that's something we haven't heard a lot in the States when we talk about Jamie Spencer, though he gets a little bit too much grief, I think. He's had some not great highlights over here, but it's not like they're all bad. And he gave some good rides this week, starting with this one. We'll talk about the other one soon, but Bold Act, I'm not sure if the plans are for the Breeders' Cup or not. They probably are, but he was just a 3-year-old coming over out of listed stakes. He had hit the board a few times in some in at least one group stakes, but he's just okay for me. He got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. As just said, this was not the strongest field. It's just what the division is now. We have a bunch of older horses. We've talked about a bunch that don't run all that particularly fast, and he took a step forward from his European form and is decent, but that's about as far as I'll go for him.
Yeah, I'm looking up Marcus Hirsch's article about this race afterwards, and I don't see any plans listed about what they're going to do next with this horse. So I don't know if he's a Breeders' Cup Turf contender. I suppose we'll see about that. I imagine Godolphin and Appleby are going to have somebody in the Breeders' Cup Turf, but it does feel like they have a few options as to who that could be. This horse definitely among them, and he's certainly a progressive sort. One of these horses that they decided to geld, but you could see why. He's a big, rangy sort, and it seems like he's figuring things out in the second half of his 3-year-old season. So, yeah, got a good ground-saving trip, angled out, and was able to slice through the pack to get up at the end. Another race where I thought being on the inside helped. Cellist, who was second, he rode the rail the entire way, was able to hold on. I thought Limited Liability ran on pretty well. He was 2 to 3 wide for much of his trip, but these are not the cream of the crop among the turf marathoners out there, Craig. Even the best American turf horses, like the Warlike Goddesses, we'll see if they're going to be up against it with some of the horses that could come over from Europe for the Breeders' Cup. So I'll be surprised if any of the Americans in the Sycamore do make a big impact on this race. But before we move away from the Sycamore, I do just want to mention one of the horses that finished towards the back of the pack is Channelmaker, and the Connections did announce after this race that it will be his final career start, and the 9-year-old Channelmaker is retired. And just want to give a mention to him, Craig, because we've talked about him so much on this podcast. Probably we've been talking about Channelmaker since we started this podcast like 4 years ago, and he was running even before that, because he's just a horse that's been around at the top of the game for so long. He was the champion turf male back in 2020, the top American finisher in the Breeders' Cup for a few years. He is the horse that has competed in the most Breeders' Cups of any horse in history, having done it 6 times, and not a horse that you're going to remember as ever being among the best American turf horses in the history of the game, but he was just a cool hard knocker who consistently showed up and gave a solid effort.
Yeah, I was hoping he'd make another Breeders' Cup, but only if he deserved it, and he probably doesn't at this point. I'm sure the Connections are doing the right thing, but it's not like he was totally hopeless this year. He won the Grade 2 Bowling Green just at the end of July, so basically going out pretty much on a high note. Couple disappointing efforts to end, but just a real warrior and the kind of horse that has really drawn me to appreciate the turf division more because we just get to see him run many more times.
Yeah, even if they aren't the best division of horses in terms of having success at the end of the year or achieving championships, we do get to see these older turf horses compete on a consistent basis and year after year, which is something that we definitely don't get in some of the other divisions. So we could always appreciate that about horses like Channelmaker. Let's go back to Saturday's card at Keeneland, Craig, and I would say the most impressive 2-year-old performance that we saw this week was by Dornoch in the 6th race, him finally breaking his maiden race. He is a horse that had been hyped right since his career debut by trainer Danny Gargan, who I think said prior to his first start at Saratoga, or prior to the meet at Saratoga, actually, that he was the best horse he had ever trained. Maybe he didn't look like that in his first couple races, though he clearly was figuring things out, but I think after this performance on Saturday, there might be something to that hype that Gargan started off, because this horse was really dominant, beating a field that had shown some ability already, winning by, I think, around 7 lengths and earning a 110 TimeformUS speed figure. This horse is good.
Yeah, I actually had that figure lower and I went back and redid the card, but it wasn't because of Dornoch. It was because of a couple earlier races on the card that I just wasn't happy with. So I wound up splitting the variant and I'm much happier with the figures for the whole day. And really, the earlier figure I had given him, which was like a low 103, didn't match the visual at all. So the 110 makes a lot more sense as well. So that kind of plays into agreeing with myself to make that change. But I want to say he put it all together, but I'm not even sure he did that. When you watch him run through the stretch, he still kind of was goofing off a little bit, wasn't really running straight. You probably know more about that to me. I just know to my eye, it wasn't a professional effort, I'd say, but it was certainly a fast one, and I'm sure that stakes are going to have to be in his future pretty soon.
Yeah, it's a tough decision to make with regard to the speed figures, and we're going to transition right to another race that was run at the exact same distance that I think, you could go one of two ways with comparing these two. But as far as Dornoch, I agree, Craig. I mean, he's still a horse that's figuring things out, but I think we're starting to see that there is talent there. I had noted on our forecast last week that if you watch the Sapling, his race prior to that, I mean, he was a little unprofessional there as well, but you could just see he was running in spots and there was real ability there. And he took another step towards putting it all together here. But even coming through the stretch, he was on his wrong lead. He never switched over before the finish line. So it feels like once he gets his lead changes right or is able to run straighter, he's going to have even more in the tank. But there obviously is ability here. And there's not much doubt this was a fast race, Craig. You just have to look at the chart. And there were some big gaps between the runners at the end. He was setting it on his pace, and he really gapped out the field coming to the wire. And that's often indicative of a race that is deserving of a fast speed figure. So I have no problem with you giving this horse the higher number. And races like the Kentucky Jockey Club or Churchill or the Remsen later in the year at Aqueduct feel like they'd be right up this horse's alley because we know he wants distance. He wants the two turns. So we'll see what Danny Gargan decides to do with him. But this is a horse, the younger full brother to Mage, that clearly has a bright future. Let's transition to the other mile and a 16th race that we were going to discuss. Well, actually, two more, but first up, we'll go to the last race of the day at Keeneland on Saturday. That was an allowance race for the 3-and-up runners won by the returning First Mission. And I imagine you were alluding to this race, Craig, which came up surprisingly slow in comparison to the Dornoch race, but the paces were very different, and First Mission wasn't ridden in a fashion to achieve as fast a speed figure as we know he can run.
No, he's the speed figure. I almost missed this race when I did the rundown, even though I watched it and I was fully aware of First Mission. It just didn't appear on my list because he only gets a 109 Timeform US speed figure, and that was bumped up from a 103 final time figure. But that's almost entirely because of the ridiculously slow pace. Airtime, a horse we hadn't seen since the Arkansas Derby back in April, set the early pace, and I put pace in air quotes because the quarter mile pace figure was just a 68. The half mile a 79, so basically low level claiming type figures, and it makes it impossible to run a very fast time. So I would definitely give extra credit to First Mission. I'm not going to count this speed figure either for or against him. He was pretty game. I mean, he didn't have the easiest of trip. He had to find some room. He had to run down some decent horses that had a big head start on him. So I would imagine Brad Cox is pretty happy with the return. It's just not a race I'm putting any stock in the speed figure.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the fractional times, he went, I believe, exactly or nearly exactly 2 seconds slower to the half mile. Actually, a little more than 2 seconds slower to the half mile time. So it's just hard for a race like that to get as fast of a final time as the one that Dornoch ran. So when you're trying to make those comparisons, it's tough to do. The number probably is a little low for First Mission, but it makes sense for the rest of the field. And when a horse only wins by a neck, you can't just inflate the number because there was a perceived good horse in there. As for the trip and the performance, I mean, I guess drawing the rail kind of gave them fewer options. I mean, Louis Saez rode him away from the gate, but a horse was ridden from the outside to clear the field, and he sort of wound up in this pocket behind horses and was in traffic for a long time. And you certainly don't have much time to extricate yourself and get up when you have got that short stretch run going the mile and the 16th at Keeneland. So kudos to the horse for earning the victory. I think the jury is still out, though, Craig, on where this horse exactly fits and what's going to be the older horse division next year, because he had shown so much brilliance early in his career. Obviously, there was a major setback that forced him to miss a lot of time when he was scratched out of the Preakness that week back in May. So I think we're building back. We'll see probably more about where this horse fits in his next start, but just hard to really take too much away from this one.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know where he's going to start. Maybe the Clark would be an option. I mean, they were pointing this horse to the Preakness. That's a race that hasn't been as strong in recent years after the Breeders' Cup. But who knows? I'm certainly not writing him off, but you just don't know if he's exactly the same horse before the layoff. And we don't even really know what he was before that. I mean, he had just broke his maiden, won an allowance race. So he's one that, he's good, but he has talent. But as you said, the jury is definitely still out.
And then yet another mile and 16th race on the dirt at Keeneland on Saturday was the third race, an allowance optional claiming event for the 2-year-olds. And this one was won by Stretch Ride, a second-time starter for trainer Dale Romans and West Point Thoroughbreds. And this is a better comparison to the race that Dornoch ran just 3 races later, Craig, because the paces of these 2 races were very similar. Dornoch just came home a lot faster than Stretch Ride did, so I mean, I suppose you could say that maybe the track sped up or something that would cause the maiden race to be run faster, but I don't know, I feel like you could probably lay these 2 races right on top of each other, and Dornoch's probably just the better horse.
Yeah, and that's what I did. I used the same variant for these races. If anything, I had the track faster for the first 2 sprint races, and that's where I made the split. The rest of the card was pretty consistent. And yeah, I don't want to take anything away from Stretch, right? He ran great. He's 2 for 2. He had a nice jump in his speed figure. He did it easily, but he just wasn't near as fast as Dornoch. So he wound up with a 101 Timeform US speed figure. Just his second start, so there's nothing to say that he can't get faster again next time and the time after that, as these are still 3-year-olds. So 2 good performances, his in an allowance race, Dornoch in a maiden race.
Yeah, it's kind of funny looking at this horse's breeding because he's a horse that originally sold as a yearling for just $5,000. I think he was subsequently sold at the Arcana sale, it looks like, in France earlier this year for $108,000, and that's when West Point bought him. So interesting path this horse took prior to making his debut, but he is a Kentucky bred son of street sense and obviously appreciated the added ground here. But I think it still remains to be seen if this is the kind of horse that's going to go on to graded stakes success later. He's going to have to run faster. And then we'll wrap up the Keeneland action from this past week by discussing an allowance race that took place on Friday, this one on the turf. And highest distinction, Craig, a horse who was formerly a claimer on the turf, has just really turned his career around since getting into the Lindsay Schultz bar. This was now his 4th victory in a row. He was actually dropping a little bit, having won a grade 3 at Laurel in his prior start, but this horse is just in great form right now.
Yeah, that's the reason I put him on here. I mean, it's not the strongest race. It was another one of those non-winners of 4 allowance, and I remember on one of our shows we had talked about how the allowance races with these big purses we're seeing in Kentucky and New York have kind of had a rebirth, and it's good to see it. I mean, this is a horse that won a grade 3 last time and shows up in one of these allowance races, so it kind of took me back to the 80s where you would see that much more regularly. We barely even see these races until just this Keeneland meet. I can't remember the last non-winners of 4 I had seen, but good effort by the 6-year-old, 4th win in a row. He gets a 119 Timeform US speed figure. I had run a 124 last time, so he's a horse who I don't know what they figured out with him, but it's certainly working, and he's one that I imagine we're going to see back in stakes races.
Yeah, he's a horse that had shown some talent very early in his career, all the way back in 2020, but obviously things had gone awry for a little while. It just seemed like he wasn't fulfilling his potential, but he's certainly gotten back on track now. And I mean, he was a really impressive winner of that stakes race. I believe I said Laurel. It was at Pimlico 2 back. And I mean, he did not get the best trip in this race at Keeneland. He was sort of getting shuffled back around the far turn. This was, I feel like, still one of those days where you wanted to be towards the inside, and he was never on the inside, didn't have great position at the top of the stretch, but still was able to run this field down to get up at the wire. So I would imagine it's going to be back into stakes company soon, and he certainly deserves to be facing some tougher horses. Let's move on to New York and talk about a couple of races from the Belmont at the Big A meet at Aqueduct. Their feature race there on Saturday was the Grade 2 Sands Point. I think there were supposed to be a couple of turf stakes races on Saturday. Unfortunately, the second one got rained off the turf, and no big surprise when you watch the replay of the Sands Point, Craig, and you could just see early in the day, even when the rain was only starting, how much they were kicking up on the turf course, big clods. It certainly was a wet turf course. I believe it was rated as good for this race, but it certainly was much closer to yielding or perhaps even soft, just given how slowly it played. And I think that played into the hands of some horses that were actually cutting back in distance out of the Jockey Club Oaks, and especially a horse like Eternal Hope, who obviously has stamina, wants distance, and she was able to handle this taxing 9 furlongs.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to make of this race. I mean, Eternal Hope wound up with a 114 time form US speed figure, but as you mentioned, it was pretty much a bog. It got a 5 on the time form US track condition rating, so right on the borderline of yielding, probably a little closer to soft easy, and it's just soft even, and it's just one of those races where some horses handled it, some didn't, and I agree with you. I think the horses who were turning back from longer probably benefited the most. It certainly looks like that when you look at the results. And uh, this group, regardless, nowhere near as good as what we saw in the QE2. So, not sure where we're going to see these horses next, but I would be shocked if any of them are Breeders' Cup now.
Yeah, I mean, Godolphin and Appleby do like to have horses in the Breeders' Cup, a lot of races, but Eternal Hope just doesn't feel like the right one. She's just beating up on weaker competition. I think there'll be much better horses than Nisi Marie. Nothing against Nisi Marie. She's a cool overachiever from Parks, but I mean, she's been a narrowly beaten second in these last two stakes in New York, and it just feels like there are stronger horses out there in this division. Another race from New York that I do want to talk about, Craig, and I'm happy you put it on the rundown, is a Sunday allowance race. Actually, an off the turf event. Was race 7 on Sunday. This one eventually going a mile on the dirt. Did a really intriguing New York bred named Straight Arrow, who had been entered for the turf. He'd actually made his turf debut in the prior start and lost that race, but was one that I thought would take a lot of money getting on the turf because he had a big trip in that race, was blocked for the entire stretch drive, arguably might have won that turf debut, but they stayed in on the dirt, which they already know he handles, and boy, did this horse take a big step forward.
Yeah, I don't know if it was just a light bulb going on or if he really liked the off track, but he ran a career best 121 time form US speed figure. Did it just dusting the field. The first quarter was actually really slow. It drew a bunch of main track only horses, so it's not like he was beating up on a bunch of turf horses. And he just kind of sat off of that slow pace. And when he tipped out in the stretch, I mean, he made very, very quick work of this field. The way he drew away was promising. Um, yeah, I'm not sure what the future holds for him if they're going to want to try to get him back on turf, but off of this effort, you would think at least one more try on a fast track and see how he handles it.
Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do with him. I was listening to the interview that Maggie Wolfendale did on America's Day of the Races with the trader Mike Deeney after this race, and he was saying that they do still have intentions to get this horse on the turf. Understandable. He's the younger half brother to Disco Partner, who is that two-time Jaipur winner and that Generazio family of turf horses. So certainly he's got the damn side pedigree to be a turf horse, and it seemed like he really did handle it in that September race. Just like I said, got completely blocked in the stretch. He is by Arrogate though, and one thing that we've seen from the progeny of Arrogate is that they get better over time, and they're pretty versatile. They definitely handle dirt routes. So Straight Arrow is a horse that seemed like he really did appreciate the extra distance. We'll see if he can also appreciate the extra distance on the turf in the future, but it was interesting to listen to that interview with Mike Deeney because he was saying that this was a horse that they actually were considering retiring before he even made a start because he just was not training well over the winter at Tampa, and actually was a really bad horse to be around. He said, I don't even know how this happens, but he said that the horse was actually banned from training at Tampa because he was such a bad actor and would depart for his rider so much. So clearly gelding him has made a big difference, and it's funny how much horses can turn around with an equipment change or a change like that, and he really has found his own since, or come into his own, I should say, since that procedure and getting a little bit of experience under his belt. Let's move on to Laurel. We'll discuss one race from their Maryland Million Day card on Saturday, and that was the sprint, 6 furlong event for the 3-year-old and up runners, and probably not the strongest edition of the Maryland Million Sprint I've ever seen from top to bottom, Craig, but I do think the winner of this race is a horse worth discussing. That's a 3-year-old named Sevens 11 who was beating his older rivals here, and a horse that just, kind of like Straight Arrow, who we just talked about, since coming back from a layoff this summer, he has just completely turned his career around.
Yeah, he has, and I mean, this was a race run over. I guess there was some moisture in the track, but it was still labeled as fast, and He's a horse who had run a 112 last time as a 3-year-old, took that step up into the, albeit restricted stakes of Maryland Million Day, but ran a huge race, got a 120 time form US speed figure for the effort. Once again, won by open lengths. I think it was 5 this time after 8.5 last time. And even if you go back to his race before the layoff, he had won a dirt allowance race by almost 3 lengths. So this horse seems to have figured out what's going on. There was a turf race mixed in where he just didn't break, didn't handle it at all. But his form has been excellent, so I would guess they would try him in an open stake, probably on the Mid Atlantic circuit, pretty soon with that kind of number.
Yeah, he's a horse that they tried in some stakes company early in his career. He was just dusted by some rivals. I think even one or two that he faced here again. And since having a layoff from the spring into the summer, I mean, you said they brought him back in that turf race, which didn't go well, but his two dirt races since then have been excellent. And just seems like a horse that things have really clicked for him lately. So definitely an intriguing new player in that Maryland Sprint division. Finish things up on this podcast at Santa Anita. We'll talk about a couple of 2-year-old races from this past weekend. Saturday, they ran a maiden special weight going a mile, won by the 3-year-old filly Nothing Like You. This one breaking her maiden for Bob Baffert as a strong favorite. And Craig, I know we were both on the fence about whether to keep these horses on the rundown because it's unclear if they're really going to ultimately prove to be stakes quality, but they are both going out for the Bob Baffert stable, and Nothing Like You in particular, one that seemed to improve at the added distance.
Yeah, and yeah, both of these we're going to talk about really hadn't shown a whole lot. Hadn't run all that great in their first two starts. Their first three starts for Nothing Like You, but the added distance really seems to help. She wound up improving her speed figure quite a bit, all the way up to 101 from an 89 last time. Not sure how strong the field was. I mean, she was even money off those not so strong efforts we talked about, so obviously there wasn't a lot entered, but the visual was good, and maybe the two turns help. So I would imagine that we'll be seeing her try a stakes maybe early in the 3-year-old season, maybe late 2-year-old, but she at least showed some more talent around two turns.
Yeah, she set a moderate pace, stayed on well at the end, but like you said, unclear what was behind her, so we'll see what she turns out to be. And as you said, it's a similar situation on Sunday with race 10 at Santa Anita, a maiden special weight won by a Bob Baffert horse on the stretch out. That was Winstock. The big difference here is that this was the rare Bob Baffert horse that broke its maiden at a price. This horse somehow going off at 13-1, and I guess that's because he hadn't shown much in his prior two starts, but this horse, another one that took a big step forward with the added distance, and at least this horse set a faster pace.
Yeah, he was a horse who took plenty of money his first two times out, going off at 8-5 and 2-1. Didn't really show anything at all, but he did here, setting that pretty quick pace and drew off to just win by 7. This one had some horses who had run in the 90s before, so he just seemed to slip through the cracks. But to go off at 13-1 seems almost unbelievable for a Bob Baffert maiden. And I can't remember if I mentioned his speed figure is going to be right around the 100 mark, similar to the filly, I would guess. Don't have that official number yet, but the future is at least looking a little brighter than it had after those first two losses.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Winstock is that he's actually a New York bred who's been competing out in California. He's a son of Salamini, who's standing his first season in New York this year. His first crop of 2-year-olds has been running in a lot of New York bred races. So they have the option of potentially shipping this horse east for some New York bred events. I believe there is a $500,000 stakes race they run every December at Aqueduct that is only open to horses by stallions that stand in New York, and I think he would qualify as a son of Salamini. So I wonder if we're going to see Bob Baffert with a starter at Aqueduct in December. I guess we'll have to see about that, but he seems like a horse that would be very dangerous to take down that kind of pot. But he is a horse that was bred to stretch out in distance, being by Salamini. I think the dam's actually, I was looking this up, she's a half-sister to a horse that won the Oklahoma Derby, named Untrapped from a few years ago. So definitely a horse that did take a step forward with the added distance.
Man, time flies. It seems like we were just talking about Salamini on Pacecast when he was on the Derby Trail, and now he's already got 2-year-olds running.
Yeah, it's funny how time flies in racing. It feels like some of these horses don't stay on the track for that long, and then a couple years later, they've got their progeny running. So yeah, things do move quickly. Well, everybody, that's all the racing to recap from this past week. Craig and I will be back for the TimeformUS forecast later this week. Haven't yet looked at how some of those races have come up. I think we'll consider Keeneland again. I think we're also doing a couple stakes previews that you could find on DRF's YouTube channel for Keeneland, Craig. So we'll see how that sequence is coming up. Or hopefully there's some better weather in the New York area, though I just looked at the forecast and it seems like there is yet again rain predicted on Saturday in New York City. So fingers crossed for what could transpire at Aqueduct this weekend. But yeah, we'll find something interesting to discuss later this week on the forecast. And as I was previewing at the start of things, we'll probably be putting out some Breeders' Cup episodes before in the not too distant future, maybe next week, because I think when those pre-entries come out, we'll put out an episode maybe a little bit later next week reacting to how those fields shape up. So everybody, thanks for listening to the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.